36,554 Americans died in Korea, over 100,000 were wounded. More than 7,700 are still listed as missing in action. Their remains never recovered. The war lasted 3 years. It reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of Asia. It pushed the world closer to nuclear war than most people know. It permanently divided a peninsula that remains divided to this day, making it technically the longest-running military conflict in American history. And most Americans cannot tell you when it started, or when it ended, or why it was fought. They call it the Forgotten War. Not because it wasn't important, not because the sacrifice wasn't real, but because America came home from World War II, the greatest, most celebrated victory in the nation's history, and 5 years later found itself fighting again, in a place most Americans had never heard of, for a result that looked nothing like victory. This is the story of the Korean War, the war America forgot. And the reason it still matters more than you think, this is Hidden America TV. Chapter 1, How It Started. To understand the Korean War, you have to understand what Korea was before the war. Korea was a Japanese colony for 35 years, from 1910 until Japan's defeat in 1945. When World War II ended, American and Soviet troops both moved into the Korean peninsula to accept the Japanese surrender. The two superpowers needed a dividing line to organize the process. An American colonel, working with a map and a set of encyclopedias, drew a line across Korea at the 38th parallel. It was meant to be temporary, an administrative boundary, not a permanent border. The arbitrary split created problems from the start, only made worse by the ideological differences of the controlling countries. The Korean people despised it, occasionally resorting to violence to protest decisions in which they played no part. The Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a communist military commander, as the leader of North Korea. America backed Syngman Rhee, the Princeton-educated anti-communist Mars in the South. The United Nations established a commission to oversee a national election that would allow an end to the partition, but the Soviets refused to allow it in the North. When the South elected Syngman Rhee in May 1948, North Korean communists countered by electing Kim Il-sung. Both leaders claimed to represent all of Korea. Both wanted to reunify the peninsula under their own system. For 5 years, tensions simmered. Border skirmishes, artillery exchanges, assassinations, and raids. Then, June 25, 1950, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel with 75,000 soldiers. The North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion, destroying or pushing back any resistance in its path. The Korean War had begun, and America, less than 5 years removed from the end of World War II, was going back to war. Chapter 2, The Near Total Collapse. The speed of the North Korean advance shocked everyone. South Korean forces, poorly trained, poorly equipped, badly outnumbered, collapsed almost immediately. American forces rushed from Japan were equally unprepared. The U.S. military had been drastically downsized after World War II. The soldiers arriving in Korea were occupation troops, not combat-ready units. Within the first month of the war, North Korea had captured Seoul, the South Korean capital, and pushed American and South Korean forces all the way to the southern tip of the peninsula. In the first month of the war, North Koreans had pushed South Korean and American ground forces into a very small area on the Pusan Peninsula of Southeast Korea. The Pusan Perimeter, a small rectangle of territory roughly 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. Everything else, the entire Korean peninsula, was in North Korean hands. The United Nations forces were one more push away from being driven into the sea entirely. It was, in the words of General Omar Bradley, a great military disaster. What turned it around was one of the boldest and most brilliantly executed military operations in American history. General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Inchon, September 15, 1950. MacArthur conceived a plan to encircle the North Koreans by making an amphibious invasion at their rear. Inchon Harbor was chosen as the landing site, partly because of its proximity to the capital at Seoul. Every military advisor said it was impossible. The tides at Inchon were the second highest in the world. The harbor was full of obstacles. The timing window was impossibly narrow. MacArthur did it anyway. It worked perfectly. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated. The North Korean army, cut off from its supply lines, collapsed and retreated north. America had gone from near total defeat to total victory in 6 weeks. And then, MacArthur made a decision that changed everything. Chapter 3, MacArthur and the Chinese. After Inchon, MacArthur was riding high. The original goal of the war, restoring South Korea to its pre-war borders, had been achieved. MacArthur wanted more. He pushed north past the 38th parallel, deep into North Korean territory, driving toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. China had been warning for weeks that if American forces approached its border, it would enter the war. MacArthur dismissed the warnings. He told President Truman the Chinese would not intervene. He told his commanders the war would be over by Christmas. He was catastrophically wrong. On the night of November 25th, 1950, an estimated 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River and slammed into American forces. In the freezing Korean winter, and temperatures of 30 below zero. The Chinese attack was massive, overwhelming, and completely unexpected in its scale and ferocity. American forces, stretched thin, unprepared for the cold, shocked by the numbers, began one of the longest retreats in American military history, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. American Marines surrounded by Chinese forces in temperatures so cold that rifles jammed and morphine froze in syringes. They fought their way out, 17 days of continuous combat, and reached the coast. Of the 15,000 Marines who entered Chosin, roughly 4,500 were killed or wounded. Thousands more suffered severe frostbite. The Marine commander, General Oliver Smith, gave one of the most famous quotes in military history: "Retreat, hell. We're just attacking in a different direction." Chapter 4. Truman fires MacArthur. As the war stalemated, MacArthur pushed for something that could have ended civilization. Truman referred to the war as a police action, even though he and top military officers entertained the idea of dropping bombs on China. MacArthur was not subtle about it. He wanted to bomb Chinese supply lines. He wanted to use nuclear weapons if necessary. He wanted to expand the war into a full confrontation with China, and potentially the Soviet Union. MacArthur set out to bomb and burn all of North Korea to the ground, and entertained fantasies of Armageddon in communist China and the Soviet Union. He was defiant of orders from Washington, mendacious, arrogant, and a loose cannon, causing the loss of many soldiers' lives in vain. MacArthur went further. He began publicly undermining Truman's position, writing letters to congressional leaders, making public statements that contradicted official U.S. policy. A general was publicly defying his commander-in-chief. On April 11, 1951, Truman fired him. The reaction in America was volcanic. MacArthur returned home to ticker tape parades. He addressed a joint session of Congress to a standing ovation. Truman, who had made one of the most constitutionally correct and strategically necessary decisions of the war, had approval ratings that dropped to 22%, lower than any president in the history of modern polling. But Truman was right. If MacArthur had gotten his way, if nuclear weapons had been used against China, the Soviet Union would almost certainly have responded in kind. A local war in Korea would have become a nuclear world war. Truman's decision to fire the most popular general in America may have prevented World War III. Chapter 5. The War Nobody Covered. Here is why the Korean War was forgotten. It wasn't because it wasn't important. It wasn't because Americans weren't watching. It was because of what came before it and what it produced. America had just won World War II, the most total, comprehensive, morally clear military victory in the history of the Republic. Good versus evil, America versus fascism. Complete victory, unconditional surrender. Ticker tape parades, the greatest generation. Korea was none of those things. The Korean War started shortly after World War II and ended just before the Vietnam War, yet received very little press coverage in the US compared to either of those conflicts, and continues to receive relatively little attention to this day. The war produced not victory, but stalemate. After 3 years of fighting, after 574 American dead, the border was almost exactly where it had been when the war started. The 38th parallel. The line drawn by an American colonel with a map and an encyclopedia in 1945. Nothing had changed, except for the dead. Soldiers came home to a country that didn't know quite what to make of them. There were no parades, no celebrations, no clear answer to the question, what did we win? The answer, which Americans found deeply unsatisfying, was, we prevented something worse. We prevented the communist takeover of the entire Korean peninsula. We demonstrated that the United States would honor its commitments to defend smaller nations against communist aggression. We established the credibility of American power in Asia, which directly influenced every Cold War calculation in the region for decades. Those are real significant achievements. They just don't make for a ticker tape parade. Chapter 6. The Facts That Shock People. Let me give you the facts about the Korean War that most Americans have never heard. The Korean War saw the unlikely collaboration of two icons of American history, Ted Williams, one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, and John Glenn, the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. Both served as Marine fighter pilots in Korea. Glenn was Williams' wingman on several missions. The greatest baseball player of his era and the first American to orbit the Earth, flying combat missions together over the Korean peninsula. The Chosin Reservoir, where Marines fought in temperatures of 30 below zero, produced one of the most remarkable casualty statistics in military history. Of the 4,500 Marine casualties at Chosin, roughly half were from frostbite and exposure, not enemy fire. The cold was as deadly as the Chinese army. The Korean War produced MASH, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital System, which revolutionized battlefield medicine. The survival rate for wounded soldiers was dramatically higher than in World War II, not because the wounds were less severe, but because MASH units could operate within minutes of the injury. MASH became a TV show that ran for 11 seasons, longer than the war itself. And here's perhaps the most chilling legacy of the Korean War. It never officially ended. The fighting stopped in July 1953 with an armistice, a ceasefire agreement, not a peace treaty. The Korean peninsula still remains divided, and the two Koreas stand antagonistic to one another. The Korean War may be seen as an ongoing situation rather than a past event. North and South Korea are technically still at war. And North Korea, the nation that the Korean War failed to defeat, now has nuclear weapons. The forgotten war is not over. Chapter 7. Why it still matters. Here is why the Korean War matters more in 2026 than it ever has. Look at the Korean peninsula today. South Korea, the country that American soldiers died to defend, is one of the most extraordinary economic success stories in human history. In 1953, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. Its GDP per capita was lower than some African nations. Its cities were rubble. Today, South Korea is the 12th largest economy in the world, home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and Kia, a global leader in technology, culture, and innovation. A democracy of 52 million people with a higher standard of living than many European nations. And North Korea, the country that crossed the 38th parallel to start the war, remains one of the most repressive, impoverished nations on earth. Its people live in darkness, literally. Satellite images at night show the entire country as a black void, surrounded by the lights of South Korea, China, and Japan. It has nuclear weapons. It has ballistic missiles capable of reaching the continental United States. And it is governed by the grandson of the man who started the war in 1950, Kim Jong-un, the third generation of the same family that has ruled North Korea for 75 years. The Korean War did not end the threat, it contained it. And that contained threat is now the most dangerous nuclear standoff in the world today. Every summit between Washington and Pyongyang, every missile test over the Sea of Japan, every military exercise on the Korean peninsula, all of it traces directly back to the decision made in 1950 when North Korea crossed a line that an American colonel drew with a map and an encyclopedia in 1945. Conclusion. There is a memorial to the Korean War in Washington, D.C. 19 stainless steel soldiers, life-sized, walking through a field of juniper bushes in full combat gear. Their faces are haunted, exhausted, looking in every direction. The memorial's wall is etched with the faces of 2,500 Americans, taken from photographs of those who served. Beneath the statues, the inscription reads, "Freedom is not free." 36, Psalm 474. Americans died in a war their country forgot. They died in temperatures of 30 below zero. They died on frozen mountains and in flooded river crossings. They died in the first hours of an invasion they weren't prepared for, and in the last hours of a stalemate that changed nothing on the map. They kept a free nation free. They preserved a country that became an economic miracle. And 70 years later, their sacrifice is still holding the line at the most heavily militarized border on the face of the earth. The Korean War was not forgotten because it didn't matter. It was forgotten because America didn't know how to talk about a war that didn't end with a parade. We should learn. I'm HiddenAmericaTV. Did you know someone who served in Korea? Tell their story in the comments, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next hidden story.